Hi, this is Ed with Tabletop Realm, and I'm here today to talk about contrast paints. It's been a year since contrast paints first hit the shelves of local game stores and got out into the community, and in that time I've been playing around with them quite a bit and wanted to kind of do a year review as far as things I've learned, ideas that have come up, and techniques that I've used while working with them. Contrast paints are very different from the kind of more traditional formulas, so we're going to talk a little bit about that today, and I'm going to show you some figures. So we're going to start by talking a little bit about the contrast paint formula. I here have Talisar Blue, which is a contrast paint by Citadel Color. For those who are uninitiated, contrast paints are designed to kind of do your base coat and a shade relatively quickly together, and so they come out a great deal thinner than traditional paints, and they're very transparent, and so you can kind of see as I work this across the palette how you get your darker colors where it pools and your lighter colors where it's thin. This can create a nice effect when those same colors find their way across the shape of a model, and so pooling in the recesses to make a dark color and being very thin and skinny on top of the raised areas. And in this case, even perhaps just a little bit, the primer is almost being a little bit repellent, but that's okay. It's this thing that we kind of work over a little bit. Contrast paint is runny like a shade, or a wash if you prefer, but it covers better, where a shade would only fall into the recesses. This is clearly still covering the raised edges as well, and this can work as a tint, for example. Typically you want to use a lighter primer with contrast paint. In particular, Citadel or GW released 2 primers for contrast. Those tend to work better. What makes those work, in my experience, is that they are kind of a glossy finish and they're light colored. So you get kind of a light gray and then you get kind of an off-white. Here you're seeing the off-white Wraithbone, I believe it's called. Because it needs a special primer, sometimes you're going to find yourself needing to touch your paint job up because you got the color in the wrong spot or something to that effect. When that happens, they have some not completely 100% color matched options, such as this Wraithbone base paint here. I say it's not 100% color matched because people seem to really have a fair amount of complaining to do in that regard, and yeah, it's going to make life a little bit harder for really trying to get that 100% color match. I find that with my painting style, I just don't need it. You know, after a couple of coats have gone on or what have you, that color match isn't going to be a concern anyway. And here you can see where it's going on a little bit too thin, so it's really just kind of pooling in the recesses more like a shade would and not covering as well on top. That means that it's too thin, time to add a little bit more to the palette. Really, any light colored primer can work. I do think they're onto something with that light gray and off-white. Transparent paint is going to show through. So if you put blue on top of white, you're going to get a light blue, kind of like you see on the palette here. But as you get multiple coats or thicker coats, like you see on the outer edge of this example, it starts to get more of that truer color. As far as touch-ups go, another good point of note is that the rest of the Citadel line features paints, base paints and layer paints that are basically using the same pigment as these contrast paints. So if you need to touch up your Blood Angels Red that you've been working with, then you can just use, go to the layer of Blood Angels Red as your touch up, and then you don't have to use the the Wraith Bone and kind of go back from the start. I find that that makes life a little bit easier in that way. This guy was base coated with a Blood Angels Red contrast, and as you can see, it's kind of got a little funny, some splotching in areas and that sort of thing. I also used Iandon Yellow for his helmet, as you can see there. The yellow turned out really good. I believe that was 2 thin coats. That was one thing a lot of people seem to have issue with as well, was when these got announced, GW came out with the 1 thick coat tagline that went with it. And to be fair, that can work. Here's a good example of sort of 1 thick coat on his robes and on the wrecking ball and on his skin. You can also see where, especially with the shades here, coming back with a little bit of that, or with a gray or a black shade, could definitely improve upon what has happened there so far. On the other hand, this squig is a good example of 1 thick coat, really doing a pretty decent job with his red there. I am obviously going to come back and add some highlights and do some more stuff with it. However, I think a lot of players could be pretty darn satisfied with 1 thick coat, with at least some of the colors in the line. We'll do one more here with this guy's robes. So this is a little bit harder to see on the camera, but that was 2 coats on his robes. I did a gray contrast followed by the black contrast. So Basilicanum gray and Black Templar for the black, and that created a nice effect there. Okay, so let's talk about basic techniques. For starters, you definitely want to shake these guys up. Using an agitator such as a ball bearing is a good idea for helping to kind of shake things loose and make sure your pigment isn't all on the bottom. Really, you don't have to worry about the pigment ending up on the bottom too much. It's a good idea to give these guys a shake every once in a while, even if you're not really using them. I think that's going to help. What will happen if too much of the pigment ends up kind of crusting on the bottom of the pot is your contrast paint will come out a little bit thinner. It'll start to behave a little more like a wash or a shade than like a contrast paint. But usually a good shake can help fix that up. Brushes that I find are helpful. I'm using a medium shade brush for most of my big jobs, and I'm using a medium base brush for a lot of my smaller jobs. You can see that some of these brushes are pretty well beat up. Doesn't matter too much, especially because most of the contrast work I like to do is fairly sloppy. It's kind of my first pass, and I know that I'm coming back with layers and highlights to kind of build on that to get a more finished effect. And with that in mind, I don't mind if it's a little bit sloppy. If you want to be more precise with it, you can. I've even done some highlighting with contrast paints, and that can be kind of nice for getting a nice smooth blend effect with that. Anyway, once you've got it shaken up, dip your brush in a little bit of water. It's okay for it to be wet. Pull a little bit of paint out and swish it around on your palette. You can thin your contrast paints with a little bit of water. You probably don't want to go too far. The more water you add, the less contrasty and the more shade-like it will be. But it's definitely going to get to a point where it's kind of just not really doing anything if you add too much water. There's also contrast medium, which is really handy for preserving the strength of that contrast effect while still thinning it down. And so here, really, just take it slow, kind of work your way across. You mostly want to kind of have one pass and then let that dry and settle before you come back. Although my more traditional painting methods kind of find me playing with it a little more than that typically. And that seems to be okay, but there is definitely a point at which you're gonna cause yourself a little bit of grief by going too far with too many passes. And so just kind of be mindful of that and watch your options. And if it looks like it's coming through a little thin, or it's not quite the depth of color you're looking for, let it settle and then come back with a second coat. Now here, really on this side where my first coat went through, that's looking pretty good. I don't want to mess with that too much. So I'm just going to kind of try to build around it as opposed to going back over it. You can see sometimes the model is going to be a little resistant to your efforts. That's okay. Just be patient with it. It's still paint, and it's still going to behave like paint in a lot of ways. Here you can really see that transparency. I've got a little bit of color that splashed onto this model somewhere along the line, and that's still showing through pretty darn well with this. Now, since I'm going to come back with a kind of a color matched layer pigment later, that doesn't bother me. But if I was trying to do this as kind of a one and done, you know, get my army painted and on the table, you know, looks good from 3 feet away thing, that could be a potential problem there. And that'd be a good example for where you'd want your undercoat to be more uniform before you got started. You can see on his kind of flamey hand there's some little details. I can kind of touch that up a little bit just to make sure I'm picking out those kind of ridges as they are. Now, say you're working with something like a Space Marine. With that, you want to go kind of panel by panel. So in my example on this guy, you would kind of want to do just that lower greave, and then just the upper part of his leg, and then, you know, just his wrist guard, or just his helmet. And you kind of want to take it slow. You don't just want to kind of slop it all over. Reason being, this is a very flat surface. The contrast isn't going to know where to pool because it doesn't have like a nice recess to settle itself into like it might with the flamer example there. A couple other ways to get around this. This one I learned from Juan Hidalgo Miniatures, who does a great series on heavy contrast painting techniques. And he describes that especially when you're working with Space Marines, you want to work your paint towards the recesses and towards the lower areas where you want the shade. So in effect, if this was the knee pad I was working with, I want to move the brush in such a way that the heavier shade shapes and colors end up towards the bottom, if that makes any sense. Layers with contrast. My favorite layer technique with contrast paint so far has been taking the aforementioned Basilicanum Gray or Space Wolves Gray and putting them all over the model first. And then I find this is especially good for darker colors, the black, the purples, the dark blues, then going back over it with your darker color. And that seems to add a little more depth to everything. What I like about it, I'll show you with my Night Goblin here again. So the example would be, here's the gray from beforehand, and then here's the gray with black over it. And you can see, I don't know how much the camera is picking up, the light seems to be pretty good, but you can kind of see where the gray has added an extra layer depth of color to the black. And it was super easy because all I had to do was contrast paint the gray and then contrast paint the black over it. And I think that's gotten a nice depth of color effect for that robe. Another example would be my Skitarii warrior here. He has a nice uniform layer of Basilicanum Gray over the metal parts. So now I can either follow that up with a real metallic silver, and it's kind of given me something to build off of, and it's created some shadows for that to be painted over, or I could go over it with some blue and try and kind of push for more of a non-metallic metal. But while I've got him out and I've still got my Talisar blue handy here, one of my favorite things to use contrast paint for, things like plasma guns. And so here it's very easy and quick to just work the contrast paint over these plasma coils and get a really nice effect for really no effort. There we go, and we'll touch it up there a little bit. And there we go, we've got a great start on a nice plasma effect. There we are. And then I can follow that up with white or something to build on what's been done there. Now let's talk about the flexibility involved with contrast paints. I'm going to take a little bit of Reaper Pure White here, and I'm going to mix it in to some of my Talisar blue that I've prepared, just to make a lighter, brighter color. And I think that was a little bit too much. So I'm going to grab a little more Talisar blue to even that out. There we go. So thanks to my palette here, I can see the difference in my blues. We can see that one is a highlight to the other, and that's just what I wanted. Now, you could definitely just do this with regular layers and the like, but what's interesting to me is the options that this provides. So I'm just going to kind of do a quick highlight over the top. And what's nice about this over a normal highlight is it really starts to blend somewhat seamlessly because of the nature of the contrast paint. And so it's got these nice fuzzy edges, and it almost feels like you're not highlighting it sometimes. That blend works so well. Let's try some back here to show a little bit off. This is also going to give you that chance to touch up some of the previous areas a little bit, although it's still very thin, so don't expect it to cover too easily or quickly, but it gives you options. And this can be nice too, because if you want that lighter color somewhere, like if I want a little color variation here, I can still contrast that on, and then when I come back with the other color, as long as I'm careful not to just go all the way over it, you get a nice blend out of it that way as well. And you can see it's lost a little bit of that contrast effect being mixed with the other paint, but it is still pooling a little bit and a little bit darker in the recesses. Just thinner and a little less pronounced than normal. And you can see I'm still using just a medium base brush here instead of the shade brush. This is really nice for using your contrast paints, but with a little more control. So after having spent a year working with Citadel contrast paints, the conclusions that I've come to, it's a very versatile paint set. You can use contrast paints for a lot of the things you'd use normal layers and base coats for. In particular, they really stand out for kind of giving you that first base coat and shade in a nice hurry, and I find that that has really sped up a lot of my army painting. I also really just like it a little bit better in general than more traditional methods of laying down a base coat and then shading it and then so forth. Having said that, it works pretty well within those techniques as well. So for example, if you were to use it in its prescribed way to get that layer in first shade, and then you come back through with another shade, you can get a really nice effect out of that. So it's fast, it helps you save steps, helps you save time, and in particular when you're working on, say, 20 Blood Reavers or 10 Blue Horrors or something like that, it helps kind of move that thing along so you can get your troops painted and on the table. It's not a replacement for my existing paints. Really what it is it's another tool in the toolbox. It's something else that I can use for any of the things I've talked about today and probably many more. It's not going to be replacing any of my base coats or layers or other paints. It's just going to be another thing I can use to get effects I'm looking for. Really happy with contrast paints. I've gotten a lot of good results out of them. Just in general, especially for things like flesh and fur and cloth, it's made my life a lot easier, helped me get things painted a lot faster than it might have previously. And so I'm looking forward to many more years of working with contrast paints and exploring other techniques and ideas. So we'd like to hear from you about what's working for you or what isn't working for you when it comes to contrast paints. Please feel free to reach out to us on Facebook or Instagram. Show us pictures, ask questions, anything like that. If there's any way we can help you with your contrast experience, we'd certainly love to. Thank you very much for joining us today. I hope this video was helpful. Please be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time with Tabletop Realm. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Where do I add that into everything else? Let's do one more take on that.